Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 10 March 2024. It is the 252nd anniversary of the birth of Karl Wilhelm Friedrich von Schlegel, who was born in Hanover on this date in 1772. I'm a day late in getting to Schlegel, but I really wanted to talk about him because what he represents is so interesting. Schlegel knew all of the movers and shakers in the Romantic movement, and his life was like the entire Romantic movement in miniature. He was born into a Protestant family. He became a freethinker in college. He wrote a novel that was considered scandalous about his affair with an older woman whom he eventually married. And after he married, he converted to Catholicism. The scandal of his novel ruined his academic career, but he published several scholarly works on language and literature. Schlegel deserves to be mentioned in relation to philosophy of history, if for no other reason than a single aphorism he wrote when he was still young. The historian is a prophet facing backward. We could say that there is an entire philosophy implicit in this aphorism, and it prompts us to ask a number of questions. As a prophet of the past, what does an historian prophesy? Ought the historian to embrace his status as a prophet and write in a prophetic idiom? Is the historian divinely inspired, or ought only the divinely inspired to write history? Does it follow that a prophet, in contradiction to the historian, is an historian facing forward? We could dismiss this as a mere enthusiasm of romanticism, that the task of the historian should be like that of a prophet. And we might well want to argue that we don't want to confuse historians with prophets, and that if a historian is fulfilling the role of a prophet, even if he's facing backward, he isn't really a historian at all. On the other hand, it might be preferable that a historian make their prophecy of the past explicit rather than writing history to a concealed agenda and making of themselves a prophet of the past without acknowledging themselves as prophets and their work as prophecy. The problem hasn't gone away in the past 250 years. Every historian who has written to advance an extra historical agenda, or what Georg Simmel called an extra theoretical interest in history, has assumed the role of a prophet without disclaiming the responsibilities of a prophet. It is entirely possible to make a show of one's historical bona fides and to present oneself as a historian when one is an historian only according to the dead letter, but not according to the living spirit. But I'm assuming that the role of the prophet and the role of the historian are distinct, and this is exactly what Schlegel called into question with his aphorism. Schlegel partially answered some of these questions when, at the end of his life, he presented a course of lectures on philosophy of history, which were published the same year he died in 1829. However, as we saw, Schlegel's life had a dramatic arc, and the romantic pronouncements of his youth are often at odds with his later works. He explicitly formulated his philosophy of history at the end of his life, when he was thought of as a conservative and not as the author of a young author of a scandalous novel, I should say. The young free-thinking Schlegel probably would have repudiated the philosophy of history of the older Catholic Schlegel, but even here, the younger Schlegel still has his claims to make on the elder. The older Schlegel's philosophy of history is almost a providential philosophy of history, and as the author of a philosophical history, Schlegel was himself taking on the prophetic role, even at the end of his life, living out the romantic ideal of the younger Schlegel by becoming a prophet facing backward. Schlegel's lecture on the philosophy of history constitute a kind of philosophy of history that I haven't yet explicitly discussed in earlier episodes, but which I hinted at in saying that he wrote a philosophical history. In my episode on J.G.A. Pocock, I talked about mapping the conceptual space of history, which hasn't been done in any kind of adequate way. Schlegel represents a particular location in the conceptual space of history, and this space has been called philosophical history. In the 18th century, historians like Edward Gibbon, David Hume, and William Robertson were called philosophical historians. In fact, Pocock wrote a paper titled Between Machiavelli and Hume, Gibbon as civic humanist and philosophical historian, that explicitly addresses Gibbon's status as a philosophical historian. At the end of his paper, Pocock wrote, quote, "What differentiates the Arabs from all other pastoral nomads is that a philosopher legislator arose among them and founded a new religion and a new civil order. What differentiates Islam from Christianity is that the former arose among heroic and superstitious barbarians, hardly, though sufficiently touched by city life, whereas the latter arose in the decay of an ancient civic order and an ancient civic religion. These are the themes that interest Gibbon as a philosopher. The heirs of primitive Islam succeeded in overthrowing the bureaucratic and ecclesiastical hierarchy founded by Constantine, and very little changed after 11 centuries. These are the themes around which Gibbon organized the later volumes of The Decline and Fall. As a philosophic historian of Western society, he laid down the pen where Robertson had earlier taken it up. He then found new, gigantic, if philosophically recalcitrant themes moving into the history of Asia as Robertson moved into that of America," unquote. So treating gigantic and philosophically recalcitrant themes, then, is one characteristic of a philosophical historian. Certainly the origins of religion or the decline and fall of an old civilization are to be accounted among these gigantic and philosophically recalcitrant themes, but philosophical history, as it was understood during the Enlightenment, wasn't only about the theme. And here I should pause to mention that Pocock wrote another paper in which he called the Enlightenment into question, especially when used, as I have just used it, with the definite article as the Enlightenment. But I will continue to use that in that way. Philosophical history was also about the way in which these gigantic and philosophically recalcitrant themes were treated. Any historian who tried to explain and to understand history rather than to merely recount historical events was called a philosophical historian. While today we don't think of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as a work of philosophy of history, in his time Gibbon was classed among the philosophical historians, and his work, insofar as it attempted to explain the processes and mechanisms of Roman decline, was understood to be philosophical. If we define philosophical history as a location on the conceptual map of history that is distinct from philosophy of history, then there would be no contradiction in saying that Gibbon was a philosophical historian, but not a philosopher of history. This might sound like splitting hairs, and it is splitting hairs when we acknowledge the close relationship between the two, but we can acknowledge the relationship even while distinguishing differences within the conceptual map of history. Another way to formulate this is to say that philosophical historians sought to show that history is an intelligible domain of knowledge. This way of putting it is open to interpretation and even open to abuse, since the intelligibility of a domain of knowledge can mean different things to different historians, and indeed it has. Hegel's notorious claim that the real is the rational and the rational is the real can be understood as a claim about the intelligibility of history, but that's not what I mean in this context. Let's allow for the time being that there is a continuum of intelligibility of history, and that the philosophical historians occupy some middle ground of this continuum with a modicum of theoretical interest, but not necessarily insisting on the rationality of the historical process as a condition of that process being intelligible. Hegel represents a place on this continuum of intelligibility closer to the theoretical or the rational end of the continuum, while, say, Herodotus represents a place on the continuum of intelligibility closer to the empirical or theoretically naive end of the continuum. Philosophical history isn't philosophy of history in the sense that I've talked about so far in previous episodes, such as speculative or analytical philosophy of history, but it is philosophy of history in the sense that Hegel called philosophy of history nothing other than the thoughtful consideration of history. Schlegel's lectures on the philosophy of history also add another element, and that is Schlegel's relationship to the Romantic movement. Gibbon was a philosophical historian of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment, if, as against Pocock, we allow ourselves to use the term, but Schlegel came later. Schlegel was a philosophical historian of the 19th century, a man of the Romantic movement and not a man of the Enlightenment. While Gibbon sought to explain the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in terms of the triumph of barbarism and religion, Schlegel sees the decline and fall of Rome through a different lens. The Enlightenment was skeptical, and for the first time in human history, it turned a skeptical eye to the origins of its own social institutions. When Gibbon published the volume of his Decline and Fall that discussed the rise of Christianity, he was roundly attacked since he had offered a thoroughly naturalistic account of the history of Christianity with no concessions to the salvation history that had been, up to his time, the unquestioned basis of providential philosophies of history. The older Schlegel had a less skeptical and more sympathetic attitude to religion in general and to Christianity in particular. But while his attitude is sympathetic, he still tries to see the conflict between Roman traditions and the new Christian revelation as part of a larger historical process. In doing this, he formulates a general principle about societies in crisis. In Lecture 10, Schlegel wrote, quote, "Whenever in the history of mankind we arrive at some epoch of great crisis or momentous collision, we find invariably and in all countries two contending parties like those appearing at once on the historical arena, though in forms or positions variously modified. The party defending antiquity often adheres only to the dead letter of rigid law, forgetting its inward sense and living spirit, while the opposite party, which has a strong conviction that the world stands in need of a new legislation and that the epoch of a new legislation approaches, is not entirely in the wrong. But when the members of the latter party have lost all faith in the sacred traditions of the past and have consequently forgotten that the great work of regeneration can emanate from God only, they conceive that it is in their power to accomplish this work. Nay, they fancy they have already succeeded in their enterprise, while all their futile attempts can accomplish naught but a total revolution in the past, a revolution brought about either by external violence or, in its best and mildest form, by the internal ruin of moral principle and feeling," unquote. Schlegel is formulating a general principle about societies in crisis and how a great crisis naturally brings out both those who defend antiquity and those who champion a novel doctrine that has the potential to bring new life to a dying social order. For Schlegel, Christianity not only represents this new life, but it also represents the basis or the foundation for the intelligibility of history. Quote, "The philosophy of history forms an essential part of the science of divine and human things, things which, in the mode of conceiving or treating them, should be rarely and even never entirely separated. For how is it possible to attain to a just and correct knowledge of human things in any department of life and science, unless they be viewed in relation to and connection with the divine principle which animates or directs them," unquote. Schlegel is saying here that the human and the divine can't be separated because we can't understand human history without the divinity that informs all of human history. And Schlegel continues, quote, "A certain medium, however, is to be observed, and the limits must be clearly and accurately traced between divine and human things, lest the one department should be confounded with the other. For as it is very prejudicial to religion to make it merely a matter of learned historical research, so it is inconsistent with the object of historical philosophy to transform it into a mere series of religious meditations. Undoubtedly, historical philosophy can and ought to assume the divine principle in man, the divine image planted in the human breast, as the great pivot of human destiny, the main and essential point in universal history, and the restoration of that image as the proper purpose of mankind," unquote. Here, Schlegel is proposing a middle ground between a purely historical account of religion, such as we might find in Gibbon, and a purely religious meditation. As we saw in the episode on David Strauss, in the later 19th century, scholars did make religion merely a matter of learned historical research. When only 6 years after Schlegel died, Strauss published The Life of Jesus, critically examined in 1836. As with the reaction to Gibbon's historical account of the rise of Christianity, again with Strauss's historical account of the life of Jesus, there was a major backlash. But Schlegel continues, quote, The philosophic historian may endeavor, as I have attempted, to point out the divine truth contained in the primitive revelation, the original word which was current among the nations of the primitive age in the second period of the world, the decisive crisis between ancient and modern times. He will discover in the Christian religion the sole principle of the subsequent progress of mankind, unquote. The contrasting examples of Gibbon and Schlegel demonstrate for us that the conceptual space of philosophical history isn't owned by one side or another. Gibbon's naturalism and Schlegel's providentialism are equally accommodated by the conventions of philosophical history, if indeed there are any conventions of philosophical history. That's not clear that there are. So is Schlegel's philosophy of history a providential philosophy of history? We could assimilate Schlegel to providential philosophy of history, but if Schlegel represents a providential philosophy, it is a post-Enlightenment providential philosophy of history that has learned its lessons. Schlegel's philosophical history is informed by the work of Gibbon, Hume, and Robertson, and to a certain extent, it builds on their work even while presenting the task of philosophical history in a different light. Not the skeptical light of the Enlightenment, but in light of the romantic philosophy and history that Schlegel largely represents. And Schlegel isn't compared to St. Augustine or to Bossuet. He is compared and contrasted to others in his milieu. And he was, in fact, drawn into a contemporary controversy as a result of his views, not so much of his views on history as his views on language. He wrote a scholarly treatise on the languages of India. The controversy he got drawn into was known as the Kreuzerstreit, which in turn entangled him in Hegel's philosophy of history. Georg Friedrich Kreutzer was a classical philologist who argued, along with several others, that the ultimate origins of Greek mythology and symbolism were to be traced to India, and Schlegel had made a similar argument. Hegel was deeply influenced by Kreutzer, but he thought that Schlegel had gone too far. So the problem for Hegel was how he could draw on Kreutzer's work without legitimizing what he saw as the excesses of Schlegel's work, which he understood as reducing the role of Greece in history to being merely derivative of India. For Hegel and for many others, the cultural independence and isolation of the Greeks was a central idea because of what Greece represented in Western history. This theme of Western civilization having its ultimate origins in India isn't an isolated idea, but is part of a larger cluster of ideas known by the Latin phrase ex orient lux, which can be translated as a light from out of the east, or from the east comes light, something like that. This is a loose term without an exact meaning. Sometimes it has meant that the East possessed greater wisdom and greater spiritual depth than the West. Sometimes it meant, as it seems to have meant to Schlegel, that ideas, particularly symbols and myths, originated in the East and were subsequently transmitted to the West. After the craze of ex-orient looks faded, attributing the origins of the West to the East, there was a hyper-diffusionism according to which all civilization originated in the Fertile Crescent as was disseminated outward from there to the East and even to the Americas. Since that time, the balance of scholarly opinion is that apparently similar symbols and myths have originated independently in geographically isolated regions, later to experience diffusion and syncretism. And this brings us back to those gigantic and philosophically recalcitrant themes that were the bread and butter of philosophical historians like Gibbon and Schlegel. So we see that the ideas of Schlegel have continued to mutate and evolve even as they have diffused in subsequent history. So happy birthday, Friedrich von Schlegel, and thanks for listening.